Old school survival horror is archaic and dead. That is the general consensus, and it's easy to understand why. Fixed camera angles, limited inventory space, tank controls, these were all features seen as bugs, necessary compromises to get horror to work on late 90s hardware. The original vision for Resident Evil was a first-person shooter, which only came to be with Resident Evil 7. The game, as it was viewed internally as a compromise. Silent Hill showed that fixed camera angles, limited inventories, and tank controls aren't necessary for horror to work. Silent Hill 2 showed that horror can tell impactful stories beyond monsters and madmen. And Resident Evil 4 perfected the over-the-shoulder gameplay as the industry standard. Whether a first-person adventure horror game like Amnesia: The Dark Descent or an action horror trip like Dead Space 2, horror games now have the advantage of tailoring experiences without needing to juggle all the requisite elements that Resident Evil established. Enthusiasts like myself continue to love the old-school horror games of the PS1 era and before, but it's easy to see why these systems became relics. Even modern indie games that revive the archaic style carry an air of falseness. Tormented Souls is a fun survival horror game that I recommend gladly to all old-school Resident Evil fans, but it feels as much like a cosplay as it does its own game. Everything in the game, the camera angles, limited saves, limited inventory, tank controls, feel included because the game is trying to be Resident Evil rather than become Tormented Souls. Honestly, I was fine with this. If old-school Resident Evil was co-signed to be the basis of loving indie revivals that seek to relive a bygone era, that's cool. No style is forever, and I thought old-school survival horror had taken its final place in history. That is, until I played SIGNALIS. Developed by Rose Engine, SIGNALIS is a 2022 survival horror game that plays uncannily similar to classic Resident Evil and Silent Hill. The game is divided into a series of lockbox areas where the player must solve puzzles, dispatch enemies, and scavenge resources. The only major formative difference is that SIGNALIS is locked down to an isometric camera. Outside of that, this is very much classic survival horror. In SIGNALIS, you play as Elster, an android built out of copied human neurons. She is one out of millions of these androids who are built to toil away in labor and die on interplanetary battlefields. Elster is searching for Ariane, her human partner with whom she fell in love. They were on a scouting mission together, looking for new worlds for the endlessly expanding empire they live under. Like wood and iron, Elster and Ariane are treated as disposable, and they are meant to die on this mission. They die, kind of, or maybe not, or not entirely. The game is a winding tapestry of surreal and cryptic images, stream of consciousness, and nonlinear storytelling. Because of the dominion Resident Evil holds over classic survival horror and our memory of it, it's easy to see why this genre seems limited in its capacity for challenging narratives.
You'll only slow me down.
The old-school Resident Evil games are relentlessly silly. For camp and gore hounds, they're gems, but like all camp, Resident Evil gained the reputation of being a well-graffitied dead end. The truly great accomplishment of the genre, Silent Hill 2, presents an equally difficult problem. It's a masterpiece, but it can't be replicated. So much of that game's mastery comes from the constraints of early 2000s hardware, as well as its stilted and uncanny localization.
Oh, it's you.
Yeah, I'm James.
Angela.
Angela. Okay.
Despite being so indebted to the genre, Signalis overcomes these assumptive hurdles. Like Tormented Souls, Signalis openly wears its influences on its sleeve. References abound to Resident Evil, Silent Hill, H.P. Lovecraft, and even Neon Genesis Evangelion. The secret to Signalis' success actually stems from its Evangelion influence. Like Silent Hill 2, the production constraints force Signalis into more imaginative realms. Taking from the avant editing of the final episodes of Evangelion, much of Signalis doesn't play out in conventional cutscenes. There are some, but they often fold over themselves. Cutscenes are collages of interactive memories, lost moments of time, disembodied voices, text from different languages, flashing symbols, 2D artwork, 3D modeling, and of course this is in symbiosis to the survival horror standard NPC dialogue and text logs. As Elster, the player traverses through a series of destroyed bases and mines where the androids have gone crazy and almost all the humans have been killed. Rather than piecing together a concrete story of Elster, REN, and what's happening in the explored areas, Signalis is creating an impression of the experience of living in a totalitarian state. Individuality and the value of one's life is ruthlessly exterminated. People are viewed as interchangeable, disposable tools of the state, and no matter how hard we fight back against it, to live within that system is to have your own personal narrative consumed into a forgotten mass. There's a cornucopia of horror games with abstract stories, but what Signalis excels at is being impenetrable. There is no single explanation or definitive story because it's a collection of moments that are out of order, forgotten, and misremembered. The narrative bends dreams and memories back over top the story to create not only a horrific tone, but also one of great melancholy, similar to a Kazuo Ishiguro novel. This is what elevates Signalis. It doesn't just view its survival horror roots as a method to scare, but to also get the player into a mindset of reflection and isolation. Its influences aren't just used as riffing material, but as an opportunity to expand the canvas of classic survival horror. On this narrative level, Signalis is aesthetically moving and relentless. It is a great testament to Rose Engine that they eschew conventional storytelling to move beyond the genre staples. It also makes Signalis fascinating in its major mechanical failure. Unlike its narrative structure, which is given wings by its influences, the gameplay of Signalis is anchored by the memory of its influences. The gameplay of Signalis carries a significant asterisk, the mark of a game too in love with the conventions of its ancestors. The two staples of old-school survival horror are limited inventory and limited saves. Not every game had both, some had one, Silent Hill had neither, and many horror games to this day play around with these restrictions. A personal favorite of mine is Kenji Eno's Devious Enemy Zero, which makes both saving and loading the game a resource. Signalis has limited inventory spaces with the fourth-dimensional item boxes a la Resident Evil, but frankly it's executed pretty terribly. You get 6 inventory spaces, which is the same as Chris in the original Resident Evil, except here the roster of guns is larger, as is the amount of different types of healing. In the original Resident Evil, almost all healing items could be combined to save on space, and both Jill and Chris got to have an exploration item for free in their inventory, while items like the flashlight in Signalis take up what is essentially a permanent inventory slot. Having the most restrictive inventory system that I've seen recently, or maybe ever, makes Signalis way more of a slog than it should be. On a first playthrough, it's easy to spend way too much time running back and forth to the item box as you forage for resources. It also means you just don't get to use all the cool guns in the game very much, since it's often quicker to run around with an empty inventory to explore with. Even just expanding the inventory size to 8, which would put it in line with Resident Evil 1 Jill, would shave a half hour off the game in just backtracking. The 6-slot inventory ultimately feels like a feature there because it's the most hardcore option to align the game with its classic survival horror roots. It's a quality that gives the impression that Rose Engine was more in love with the idea of having a super limited inventory rather than building the game around it. It's a shame that Signalis has this blotch, but it's only one. And it doesn't take away from what Signalis proves about classic survival horror, which is that it's not dead, it's not archaic, and far from it. This is, I hope, no longer a genre of just love letters, but an open field for the darkest and most terrified places in our imagination.